This is your host, Danny, and this is Do You Know from English Plus Podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about folklore. Do you know what folklore is? Do you want to learn about folklore? So join me in this episode and we will talk about folklore. But before we do that, let me remind you that you can become a patron of English Plus Podcast, and by doing that, you will have access to all our premium episodes and to English Plus Magazine, a weekly magazine that includes a variety of topics and will complement what we're doing here in English Plus Podcast. And you can also subscribe to English Plus Podcast channel on Apple Podcasts to have access to all our premium episodes. But if you want to get the magazine, you know where to go. You can become a patron on Patreon, and by doing that, you will be supporting me to continue producing English Plus Podcast episodes and English Plus Magazine. And now, without further ado, let's talk about folklore. Come sit and listen while I tell you a story. Have you ever heard of Robin Hood from Sherwood Forest, who robbed from the rich to give to the poor? How about Snow White biting into the poisoned apple? Then there's Jack, who traded his mother's cow for a handful of beans. But they turned out to be magic beans that grew into a giant beanstalk. What these stories have in common is that they are all folklore. They are stories passed on by word of mouth from parents to their children. So how long has folklore been around? People have shared folklore for thousands of years. We are natural storytellers. Before they were printed books, we entertained ourselves and taught lessons through stories. Besides storytelling, people passed down folklore through jokes, songs, poetry, riddles, nursery rhymes, and even art. Over the years, a folklore story is told and retold. People living in different times and different places sometimes change the stories to fit their own shared beliefs. So, what about the different types of folklore? People often use folklore to explain how the world was created or how a lake or mountain came to be. We also keep track of our history and our culture's special heroes through folklore. Folklore can tell an endless story like the house that Jack built. Folklore can be a tall tale like stories of Paul Bunyan or Mike Fink on the American frontier. Many folklore tales have a hero, like Hercules, who uses wisdom or strength to overcome great challenges. Folklore can feature magical or supernatural creatures like fairies, dragons, and ghosts. Folk tales from West Africa and those of Native Americans might have a trickster character, often an animal that is small and smart, but greedy too. This character stirs up trouble and teaches lessons by tricking others. Folk traditions are also passed down from parents to their children through the years. These traditions include folk dances, folk music, games, favorite recipes, rituals, and special festivals. So, how do we study folklore? People began studying folklore from the past during the 1600s. People who study folklore are known as folklorists. From 1812 to 1815, two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, collected and retold German folk tales. Writer Hans Christian Andersen retold many folk tales from Denmark. Folklorists try to learn where folk tales come from and what things stories from around the world have in common. Folklore societies preserve folklore for the future. As early as 1905, a folklore society used Thomas Edison's invention, the phonograph, to record folk songs. Today, folklore is saved in written works, preserved on audio tape, and retold in movies. Then why is folklore important? From the time people first gathered around a campfire and listened to a story, folklore has linked us to our past. Over time, folklore changes to meet the needs of different people living in different times. But folklore carries clues to a culture's traditions, beliefs, and history for future generations. Let the stories continue. So, that is everything I wanted to share with you about folklore. I hope you learned a thing or two you didn't know about folklore before, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. This is another Do You Know episode from English Plus Podcast, and this is your host, Danny. Thank you very much for listening. I will see you next time.